It's not this way?
You're American, you're not here in Eastern Europe. What's it feel like as a man who's been writing books about this stuff?
Being here is pretty impressive, being that I've studied and have been writing about this stuff for many years and only seen pictures. Now I'm in Transylvania, the real deal. Ah, behold.
Rust on the blade, it's been too long. Echoes of glory in a world gone wrong.
There's the castle. Pretty impressive looking, actually. So imagine being here on this field and constantly hordes are coming up and down, fighting right here in these fields, and guards are coming down, patrolling this area back and forth. Now, of course, it's just an empty, picturesque, ruined castle. Being here is pretty impressive, being that I've studied and have been writing about this stuff for many years and only seen pictures. So now I'm in Transylvania, the real deal, which unfortunately most Americans just associate with Count Dracula. But it's a lot richer than that, including in the context of the fault line that I study and write about, Islam and Christendom. Ugh, I'm melting. You'd think an Egyptian guy, man, wouldn't sweat like this. See, it blocks the sun, but then it makes my head even hotter. You know, that's what the Bedouins do when they wear turbans. I heard the whole point of a turban is to create sweat in your head, but then that sweat is used as cool water to cool you down. Something straight out of Dune, which is where that Herbert got all his ideas, by the way. Jihad and Holy War. He based the Fremen, or Freemen, on Arabs, Bedouins. This way?
Yeah.
The closer I get to this fortress, if you're a Lord of the Rings fan, really looks like and resembles, at least what one would imagine, Weathertop, where Strider, Aragorn, takes the hobbits on their way to Rivendell, hiding from the wraiths, the ring wraiths. And that's where Frodo foolishly, well, they make a fire, if I recall, and then that draws the attention of the Nazgul, the ring wraiths, and then Frodo foolishly puts on his ring to hide from them, big coward, which only makes him more visible to them. Then he gets a Nazgul blade, shafted in his heart. Anyway, there you go. Rambling Ray, rambling with and listening to Ray ramble.
Who's got the guts to bring back the Crusades?
So we're here at Colchesty Castle, the ruins of it, as you can see, high up in the mountains, Transylvania still we're at. If you can see behind me, that's the secular stone, which is not secular, like non-religious, but the Seke people, Hungarians that live in Transylvania, and that they call that their stone, which is supposed to be sacred to them. I'll have them explain that at some point if they want. But why this particular fortress was built on this lonely mountaintop is in the context of the Mongol invasions, which happened around, well, they really started culminating between 1241 and 1242. And a lot of people know about that, they hear the Mongol invasion, but not many people really understand how catastrophic these events really were. So the king who built this was the Hungarian king Bela IV, and he's actually known as the second founder of the Kingdom of Hungary. Why? Because the Mongolians absolutely devastated Hungary. A conservative estimate is that something like 25% of the Hungarian people were killed in between 1241 and 1242. So just imagine that for a moment, let that sink in. That's like every household, and homes there were bigger, more family members, has like something like 2 people killed. Every single household in a country. Can you envision that? People talk about trauma today because someone misgendered you. Now, that's real trauma, okay? An entire nation everywhere devastated, burned to the ground, and corpses piled high, pyramids of corpses, as the Mongols were wont to construct. And it wasn't just Hungary, of course. Russia, much of it was burned down, mass slaughter, mass enslavement that you can't begin to acknowledge or recognize. And the Mongols, even Poland, Belarus, giving them their modern names. Most people don't know that the Mongols actually had reached a point, they were at Croatia, Adriatic Sea, and were poised to start invading or besieging Vienna. Well, not necessarily besieging, because that wasn't their thing necessarily, but they were good at burning and ransacking and destroying everything in sight. In fact, most Europeans believe that had not the Khan, the Mongolian Khan, died, who he did right around 1242, causing all the Mongols to retreat and go back to Mongolia to elect the new Khan. There's good reason to believe the whole of Europe would have been overrun by the Mongols during this time. So imagine that for a second. And so this castle was built soon after that by King Bela IV, as mentioned, as were many stone structures, precisely to fend against the Mongols. Yeah, quite the sight. And again, looking at fortresses like this, which are just these picturesque little haunts now that have no real significance, it's a reminder of how Europe, or what was known as Christendom, was constantly being embattled. Okay, so this Mongol invasion that precipitated the building of this particular fortress in the late 13th century following the Mongol invasions is just the tip of the iceberg, basically, of what was happening to Europe and Christendom in general for centuries. And the true, of course, original contender, opponent, invader, and killer of Christendom was Islam. So if you go back now to the 7th century, and we can talk a little bit about the Arab conquests, which were even more traumatic than what the Mongols did. The Mongols, what they did was very short-lived and very traumatic, but what the Arabs and the Muslims did, starting in the 7th century and continuing thereafter, had immense historic consequences, unlike the brief horde passing through Europe in the 13th century. So envision with me now, the problem is when we talk, everyone who hears the word Christendom, they think of Europe, right? And they think of medieval Europe. But really the concept of Christendom was the united Christian world, which was of different peoples, nationalities, and languages, but their overarching identity, that which kept them all in common, was that they were Christian. And I know today people, maybe their primary identity might be their nation or their race, and then they can be this or that religion. But then actually religion was accepted and seen as the primary identifier of a person. And so really, if you want to talk about Christendom from a historic point of view in the 7th century before the Arab Islamic invasions, what was the Christian world? Well, it was Europe, south of the Danube, west of the Rhine, Britain, and all of North Africa. This is the tricky part people forget, and the Middle East, and what we call Turkey, Anatolia, Asia Minor. So that was the Christian world. And in the 7th century, beginning, Muhammad dies in 632, Arabia is consolidated under Abu Bakr, the first caliph, by 634. Then the mass invasions, or as they're explained, the jihads in Arabic chronicles begin in earnest. And immediately we know the countries that get conquered, and we often hear things like the Byzantine Empire got conquered. Well, first of all, it was never called Byzantine. It was coined that about a century ago. It was the Roman Empire, and that's why in the sources, the Arabs even speak about the Byzantines as Romans, okay, because it was the natural continuation of the Roman Empire. Constantine the Great moved the capital to this ancient city called Byzantium, and it became Constantinople, but then they used that word Byzantium to refer to the entire civilization. But to the people then, both the Christians and to the Arabs, they were Romans, okay? So when the Arabs start invading from Arabia, they conquer Greater Syria, which then encompassed all those little countries that are there today, nation states, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon, all those areas. And then Egypt. Syria is really conquered in 636 following the Battle of Yarmouk by the Yarmouk River in Syria. And then Egypt by 641. Persia, the Sasanian Empire is conquered also right around that same time and overrun. And then, okay, all the way left, west of Egypt, right? The modern nation states of Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco. Morocco is basically conquered by the end of the 7th century. And now Muslims invade and conquer Spain in the year 711, okay? And by 732, so this is 1 century after Muhammad's death, they're in the middle of France. And you've maybe heard of the Battle of Tours or the Battle of Poitiers, right there in the middle of France. And that's where they're basically stopped. And it's believed had they not been stopped, those rapid conquests of all that ancient Christian territory would have continued going on throughout Europe. And at the same time, keep in mind, Constantinople, the Christian empire in the east, is being bombarded. It's called in the sources Rome, actually, by a lot of the Arab chroniclers. It gets besieged by the Arabs on multiple occasions. Two big ones was around 650s, and the bigger one, 716, 717. At any rate, the point is you have all these massive conquests, and people don't realize that before countries like Egypt and Syria and North Africa were conquered, they were not just part of Christendom, but they were the more important part. This is actually where all the early church fathers, ecclesiastical councils, where the Bible was collated, and this makes sense because they're closer to where Jesus lived, right? The Holy Land. So Egypt, which now you say Egypt, you think it's, oh, of course it's Islamic. Syria, of course it's Islamic. Turkey, Islamic. No, those were the older Christian territories. St. Paul writes all these letters. Revelation mentions cities in Asia Minor, Turkey. Okay, and even linguistically, these people in Egypt, for example, and in Syria, they spoke Greek, Hellenism, because Alexander the Great conquered that region around 330 BC. And it stayed Greek-speaking for centuries until the Arabs came. So literally almost a millennium, right? Arabs come in the 630s from the 330s BC. So we're talking well over 900,000 years. It was Grecianized, if you will. All of Syria was too. I mean, there's a lot of scholars believe even Jesus spoke Greek. The New Testament is written in Greek, right? The overwhelming majority of it. So people forget all of that. So if it's Greek, well, it was part of the Christendom, right? It was part of Byzantium, as we use that word. All of that gets conquered and severed. Very traumatic event for Christendom, for Europe especially, because it's sort of a younger brother that was kind of getting knowledge and even resources coming from North Africa and the Middle East. Like I said, that's why the emperor moved everything there. So a traumatic event, and this is actually what ushers in the Dark Ages, right? We're talking now by the year 800, you have Charlemagne is crowned Holy Roman Emperor. And what's also interesting, I started telling you about the Mongols, which gave occasion to the construction of this particular fortress. But around now, at the same time, others are attacking Christendom. You have the Vikings, coming from the north, and I know they've been much romanticized now, and everyone thinks the Vikings are cool, but you wouldn't think they were cool if you were living in England or in Ireland or in France, because they were behaving like Mongols, okay? They were ransacking, engaged in mutilating people, hacking their noses out, gouging their eyes, enslaving them, burning churches. You also at the same time had from the east the Magyars, okay, and they came in and swept into the east. They attacked places like Italy and Germany, but most people don't know this. While they were very much Hunnish and like the Mongols, insofar as the atrocities they committed, these are the progenitors or the forebears of the Hungarians, the modern day Hungarian nation. So the difference, I'd say, is between the Vikings and the Magyars, and before them, the Teutons, the Germanic peoples who overran Rome. The difference is they all assimilated into Christendom and became Christians. Islam did not do that. You know why? Because in its own core doctrines, Islam in many ways was created as a force against Christianity. It literally says in the Quran and in the Hadith, the words of the Islamic prophet Muhammad, that, it's all about the oneness of Allah. This is Tawheed. When you see ISIS doing this, they're proclaiming what's called Tawheed, oneness, extreme, staunch monotheism. And where did they get this idea? Because they want to make clear that Christians are wrong with the idea of the Trinity, which was very prominent when Muhammad arose in Arabia in the 7th century, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Even the Quran says directly, Jesus is not the Son of God. God is not one of three. Infidels are they who say Jesus is the Son of God. Fight the people of the book, in this case Christians, until they pay tribute, etc., or kill them or subjugate them. So in its core doctrines, Islam was set against Christianity, which is why, unlike pagan peoples, it did not assimilate like the Vikings and the Magyars. And the Magyars, in many ways, it's ironic. The Vikings, too, they went on to become some of the greatest heroes of Christendom, because the Magyars become hungry. And as we'll see in a little bit in this recounting, the Hungarians played a pivotal role in the defense of Christendom. And the Vikings, particularly their Norman element, the ones who settled and became Christian in northern France, Northmen, were also champions of the Crusade. So that's the main difference between all these guys and the bombardment that went on from these outside forces. So now I'm in a really tight spot in this castle, which reminds me of something, a point I should elaborate, the truncation of Christendom. I was telling you about how in the Arab conquest, 7th century, in 1 century, basically from Egypt, Syria, all of North Africa, Spain conquered. If you look at a map, literally this is something like at least 2/3 of what was Christendom was actually conquered and Islamized over the centuries. All right, so if you think the Mongol invasion was traumatic, which it was, but as far as a long-term consequential kind of trauma, what happened in the 7th century was definitely traumatic in that sense. And even to and what's really unfortunate is people don't even know this. So if you talk about Egypt or Syria or Libya or any of these countries, it's just assumed that they were always Islamic or at least Eastern, Oriental. Well, no, as I pointed out, they were actually the more important part of the Christian world. So imagine that. The more important part was truncated and narrowed down, kind of like I am right here, which is why I was thinking about it, reflecting on that thought. So let's go explore some more of this castle without hitting my head. again, looking at this and thinking about the truncation of the Christian world, what I just summarized to you, the beginning of Islam up until these 7th century conquests, that's just the beginning. And it actually continues century after century. So this is the context actually of the Crusades. The Crusades are called for, First Crusade in 1095, against Muslims in the Holy Land, because the Holy Land was always very important to Christians. It's where Jesus Christ lived, was crucified, resurrected, also all the Old Testament patriarchs and prophets and etc. So a very important area for them. And based on what Muslims had been doing there, which is of course attacking Christians. This happened all the time, century after century, but right before the First Crusade, it was a particularly bad and egregious time. This is the rise of the Turks. So after the Arabs, who initiated the original Islamic conquest of the 7th century, they start fading away in importance, even though, of course, it's their language and their culture that Islam is ossified around, essentially. But now you have the Turks, and they become the new standard bearers of the jihad. Literally, that's how they saw themselves. It's well known that they sank their teeth, the Turks, into the concept of jihad more than anyone else before them, including the Arabs, and that's because jihad is a very tribalistic concept. It's us against them, right? That's what the Quran basically teaches. The us is the Muslims, the believers. The them is the non-Muslims, and the them, okay, they're free game because they're infidels. They should be attacked. They're enemies. They should be killed. They should be enslaved or forced or coerced or cajoled into becoming Islamic. And so lots of nomadic peoples took to Islam very easily because it already fit in their pre-existing paradigm of society, right? Which is us against them, tribalism. That's why the Arabs became Muslims very easily. That's why the Turks, that's why the Berbers became Muslims. And that's why the Mongols, some of them, the Tatars, as we call them, were Islamized because they took to it very naturally. So anyway, these Turks, and one of the more important iterations would be the Seljuk Turks. This is the time of the First Crusade. They were committing massacres everywhere in the Holy Land, but especially in Asia Minor, which again, remember, was Christian. Asia Minor is today Turkey. According to the sources, I'll look up Matthew of Edessa sometime, or if you don't want to, you can look it up in my book, Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and West. What I'm actually telling you right now is a summary of that book. But there's a lot of primary source quotes from Matthew of Edessa and many other people, including Turks and Arabs, which make it very clear that the jihad in Asia Minor in the 11th century preceding the First Crusade was a bloodbath. It was not unlike the Mongol attacks, and the sources talks about tens of thousands, especially Armenians, but also Greeks, Assyrians being slaughtered, decapitated, crucified, thousands of churches being burned to the ground, turned into mosques. And again, keep in mind, all of this it features the jihadist mentality that we see, or we're told exists only with artificial modern groups like ISIS. Actually, look at the sources. Even those Muslims were screaming Allahu Akbar, Allah's greater, and other jihadist slogans and calling the Christians infidels and telling them there's only one God, he doesn't have a son, etc., etc. So that's the context of these wars. And Asia Minor is completely ravaged, but also the Holy Land, because the Seljuks end up taking over the Holy Land and they start committing all sorts of atrocities against the Christians, including pilgrims from Europe, because I told you the Holy Land was always important, had always been coming to the Holy Land and, paying tribute, paying whichever caliph or sultan was in charge, because that's why they kept it open, because it was a great financial resource for the Muslims, because so many Christians would come. And during this time, even though pilgrims would occasionally be attacked and harassed, it was really bad. And one of the more notable instances occurred around 1064, 1065, talks about a very large German pilgrimage. And the writer, the author, the chronicler talks about how there was a very noble abbess, a head nun, who was very comely, very pretty. And it says that these shameless men, the Turks, attacked this caravan of German pilgrims, killed all the men, and gang raped this woman till she breathed her last. And then at the end it says, and the Turks committed these sorts of atrocities all the time on pilgrims. Hence why the First Crusade was called, okay? It's not what you've been told, which is just a bunch of, xenophobic, Islamophobic, racist Europeans who just wanted to go and, colonize the Middle East. And just to show you how this fictitious version that I just mockingly mentioned is actually really ingrained, John Esposito, former professor at Georgetown University, who I just learned passed away about a week ago. He was actually a very looked up to authority. And in one of his books, it's called Islam, the Straight Path, he has a sentence which I'm sort of paraphrasing, but it's mostly verbatim. And he says, 5 centuries of peaceful coexistence elapsed between Christians and Muslims before an imperial papal power play led to a series of so-called holy wars, which have left centuries of mistrust and grievances from Muslims towards Christians. So he's saying that all this time that I'm telling you, from that century of conquest, the truncation of Christendom, 2/3 lost, and the rise of different jihadist iterations and dynasties, including the Turks, the Seljuks, and all the atrocities and the massacres, he's telling you that was peaceful coexistence until the First Crusade ruined it. So the First Crusade just happened and ruined peaceful coexistence. Such are the lies that are entrenched in the current historical narrative concerning what happened between Christendom and Islam. So that's one of the greatest ironies of the Crusades. They're always preached in a vacuum. They're always taught as if they're these things that just happened when Muslims and Christians were living peacefully side by side in the Middle East and the Islamic world, until those Christians in Europe decided to go and ruin it all. No, it was because countless atrocities were being committed against Christians. Holy sites, churches, the Holy Sepulchre was being desecrated. It was destroyed, razed to the ground by a Muslim caliph in 1009, actually. Hakim Ba'amrullah. That's the backdrop. And then it even gets more ironic because we still haven't finished the constant assault on Christendom in the name of Islam, which is the one that maybe some people are familiar with, the Ottoman iteration. So again, we go back to the Turks. I was telling you about the Seljuks. They start fizzling out in part due to the Mongol conquests or the Mongol eruption, which really had an impact on history in that part of the world. And you have these various Turkish chieftains. A lot of them are in Asia Minor. One of them, which was very close westward, close to Constantinople, founded by Usman, another Turkish chief who gave his name to the Ottoman Empire. And these guys, again, like the other Turks before them, were great practitioners of jihad. Alas, that's what their sources say. That's the way they describe what they were doing and why they were doing it. They habitually talk about the need to attack and subjugate and kill Christians, and the need to destroy churches and turn them into mosques, which of course happens in 1453, the most dramatic event of all, the fall of Constantinople, Rome. Okay, as the way it's seen in the sources and described, Rome finally gets conquered. Not old Rome, but new Rome, Nova Roma. Its official name, actually, Constantinople, gets conquered in 1453 by Muhammad II, who we talked about a little bit. He's a prominent figure in the context of the Long War with Christendom. He's known as Muhammad al-Fatih, or the Conqueror, due to his many special conquests of Christian territory. So the Ottomans, people know maybe about the fall of Constantinople, but Islam, Ottoman Islam, continues spreading into the Balkans. All of the Balkans, most of them, Bulgaria, Greece, Serbia, all get conquered, placed under vassalage. Here we are, Transylvania. This was at certain times also under Ottoman rule, for sure. That's for a long time. Hungary itself and modern-day Romania, Wallachia also. So people forget that, okay? So let's start from the very beginning. We're talking about Christendom, which was, yes, most of Europe and all of North Africa, the Middle East, and what we call Turkey. And now you fast forward 1,000 years from the times of Muhammad and the initial conquest in the 600s. 1,000 years later, at 1683, Islam is now, the Ottomans are actually now besieging Vienna. And they had a very good chance of actually conquering it, but they didn't. And it doesn't even end there. People sometimes forget of the Barbary pirates. These were the Muslims living in North Africa. Their entire economy subsisted on raiding Europe and enslaving Christians. And we know that between at least in one particular area, I believe in Tripoli, and something like in a 1 century frame, there was something like 1.2 million enslaved Christians. That's just in that time frame. And the historian, you can look it up, I think it's called Muslim Masters, Christian Slaves. His last name is Davies. Anyway, so you had these slave raids constantly going on. And again, to those Muslims, it wasn't just slavery. They were actually justifying it in the context of jihad. And you know who even found this out? The United States of America. So America's very first war as a nation after it gained independence from Britain was with Muslims from North Africa enslaving American sailors. And when Thomas Jefferson met with one of the ambassadors, one Abdul, one of the ambassadors from Barbary, and said, why are you attacking our vessels and enslaving our men? Why don't we work together, have trade, etc.? This Abdul basically quoted the Quran. He paraphrased Quran 9:5, known as the sword verse. Look it up sometime if you can find a faithful translation. And the sword verse basically says, wage uncompromising warfare on non-Muslims, wait for them in ambush, enslave them, and kill them. Do whatever you have to. He paraphrased that in the letter that Jefferson wrote to Congress, saying that after he told him, why can't we just work together? The ambassador said, well, he said literally, our Quran and our prophet, Muhammad, say you are the enemy and it is our duty to subjugate you, kill you, and enslave you any which way we can, okay? And this goes on, so now we're at 1 millennium, all right? This is the explanation for so many forgotten episodes of history, what was driving it. It's called this thing jihad, which is part and parcel of Islam, and which for some reason here in the West we have to insist doesn't exist, and it's just this thing that's being hijacked and mangled and distorted by a radical ragtag groups that don't speak for anyone like ISIS. So this little fortress is essentially the story of Christendom, the embattlement of the Christian world, how it was truncated, shrunk, habitually, bit by bit, and why these things were built to fight against it. This one I already mentioned was in the context of the Mongols, because there were always enemies of the Christian world, Mongols being a short-lived one, more or less, whereas Islam was the primary foe. And now it's, like I said, a picturesque, forlorn little fortress where whoever drives by, sees it, and goes, oh, this is kind of cool, it's neat. And they forget what this was all about, which was preserving and protecting Christian Europe, which is a tiny, tiny thing in the context of the world. Like I said, it kept shrinking. Christendom itself wasn't that huge in the context of the world, but 3/4 of it eventually were lost following the conquest of Asia Minor, Turkey, what we call today. And this sort of thing continued until the West became, I guess, secular. And the foe that finally destroyed Christendom wasn't an external foe. It was the descendants of the West themselves, I suppose, and their amnesia and their forgetfulness and their absolute indifference, I guess, to the Christian identity of the continent. And the best way you can see this is mass migration, right? So the old foe, and they see themselves as the old foe, many of the Muslims do. They talk about entering Europe and conquer it now, not by force, because they can't, because Islam is much weaker than the West militarily, technologically, economically, but they're being brought in by the millions, and they're changing the demographics of much of Europe. Go to some of these bigger cities like London, for example. It's becoming essentially Islamized in many places in France, Sweden, Germany, Austria, the list goes on. And they still have these little fortresses that were created by their ancestors to defend and preserve their Christian traditions and identity and heritage and culture. But it's being just thrown away by the actual descendants themselves. I often think to myself, the men who built this and manned these things and fought and bled and died by the millions over the centuries, if they could only see their descendants now and what they've done, what a disgrace it would be. So these are my last moments here in Transylvania. I've been here for, I think, a week almost. And I came for Tushvanjosh festival. This very interesting festival. I liked it. A lot of people speaking events and also merrymaking and whatnot in Transylvania, nestled up in the mountains, very pretty place. I saw Santa Ana Lake. If you know about it, you'll appreciate its beauty. But then after that, we went hunting for various hotspots of the long war between Islam and Christendom. And this included visiting lots of Vlad Tepesh's, Vlad the Impaler's places, including, one of the most places associated him with, which has nothing to do with him, Bran Castle. But we also saw Turgavishte, his princely court. And we saw Poneri Castle, which was a feat to reach, 1,500 steps to climb to. Not for the faint of heart, but it was worth it for me. And they have many impaled statues up there. It's kind of catchy, but it catches the mood. And finally, we're here at Colchesty Castle, I think it's pronounced, in Transylvania. Looking at this little lonely fortress, in many ways, it's among the more impressive sights I've actually seen. Like I told you, built around 1290s, King Bela IV, in the context of trying to defend against forthcoming Mongol invasions, which were so devastating. So being here was definitely an interesting experience, seeing all these places that I write about and read about and think about. And I guess the number one, the thing I take away from it is how much the people who live here, and I can't get into their minds, obviously, but, or at least how modern people just don't appreciate the significance of what these things really meant and what they were about. And they've been sort of sensationalized and, pushed aside and turned into, meaningless things. Vlad, he's Count Dracula and he's just some lunatic who impales. No, it was actually about a very long and traumatizing war with the Ottomans, the Muslims. We also saw John Hunyadi, Hunyadora Castle, where John Hunyadi, another great defender, actually he's more popular in general than Vlad the Impaler. He was a great general, Hungarian warlord. He was also the voivode of Transylvania. We went to his castle, his family castle. This is another man that was his whole life fighting the Turks and again, positing it and presenting it in the context of defending Christendom against Islam as he discussed it. All of these, by the way, if you're interested, are in my books. I have a trilogy that discusses all these events. First one is Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West. That's a subtitle, which should tell you it's a comprehensive history that deals with the beginning of the Islamic attacks in the 7th century and goes all the way to the modern era, mostly by tracing 8 pivotal battles. And then I have Defenders of the West, the Christian heroes who stood against Islam. That's where John Hunyadi figures, Vlad the Impaler, and 7 other historic characters, and I put them in their context and what they did. And my newest book, The Two Swords of Christ, which deals with the military orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers particularly. And it's called Two Swords because there's a pun there. They are the two swords, but also they, the military orders in particular, but Christians in general, would often emphasize the verse in Luke where Christ says, "He who doesn't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one." And his disciples say, "Look, Lord, here are 2 swords." And he says, "That is enough." Of course, that means nothing now to modern day Christians, but what it meant to medieval Christians is that Christ was basically establishing 2 forms of warfare. One spiritual war with a spiritual sword, and one secular corporal war against physical evil, against jihadists, against invaders, against Mongols. That was a Christian thing. That's how it was understood. Yes, you can defend yourself, you can fight, you can kill, because you're defending the innocent, you're defending women and children from being raped and enslaved. So it was a good thing. So that's the 3rd book, and I think they all complement one another. And those are just my thoughts, being in this nice, empty, remote stronghold that's just now, ghostly ruins left and forgotten and just seen and kind of remarked on as just, oh, what a quaint little place, without appreciating the deep, long, traumatic history behind it all.